I'm going to introduce our first group to get started. Look at that, with 7 seconds to go. What a good timing we got. So I'm going to first introduce our two respondents, which is going to be Teresa Eyring, who is the Executive Director of Theater Communications Group, and Gary Anderson, Producing Artistic Director of Plowshares Theatre here in Detroit, coming on just now. And they will respond in that order. And let me do a little introduction for our presenter, Tim Dang. Tim has been the producing artistic director of East-West Players for 15 years. That is the nation's premier Asian American theater and the longest-running professional theater of color in operation. And those 15 years is just the part of the 35 years he has worked at that organization. Take note, millennials. It is possible to work in one arts organization for 35 years. Mr. Dang, along with Teata Productions, hosted the 3rd annual National Asian American Theater Conference and Festival, bringing artists from 7 countries. He is also on the board of Arts for LA, Theater Producers League of LA, and Consortium of Asian American Theaters and Artists. And today's topic is 2042 Sea Change. Reality Confronts the American Theatre. Please welcome Tim Dang.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much to Aaron and Sphinx for inviting me this afternoon. During the course of the presentation, I will be sharing some photos of productions that exemplify the work that East-West Players does in Los Angeles. And I am honored to share with you an aggressive initiative to challenge my colleagues in the American theater so that we can see definite change by the year 2042. I am proposing to all theater leaders across the country to include in their vision a board-approved diversity policy for their organization, a policy integrated into their strategic plan, a policy that runs deep into programming, the hiring of artists, production crews, their staff, board recruitment, audience development, and donor relations. This is a tall order, but we have to begin somewhere, and this is how we begin. Commit to a visionary goal, not a quota, over the course of the next 5 years to 2020 of reaching at least one of the following levels. 51% of your organization's artists and production personnel combined will be people of color. Okay? I'm going to let that settle in a bit because I know there's a lot going through your mind right now. Or consider another option. 51% of your organization's artists and production personnel combined will be women. Okay, so now you're thinking, we may be close. It may be possible. We have the numbers. All we need to do is to do the surveys and the demographics. Or consider this. 51% of your organization's artists and production personnel combined will be under 35 years of age. Now that is the mentoring of our next generation of artists who will appeal to the next generation of audience who will then become our next generation of donors. Now artists shall include performers, playwrights, directors, designers, musicians, and artistic staff such as artistic directors and literary managers. Production personnel shall include stage managers, carpenters, electricians, and running crew. Now this is a very aggressive first phase for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the American theater. And perhaps down the line in another phase, we could ask our funders, our government funders, foundation funders, corporate funders, to request an organization's diversity policy when an organization is applying for funding. So let's look at some facts. By 2050, according to a CNN report, 54% of the US population will be minorities or people of color. According to the US Census, in reports by the New York Times and the Council of Urban Professionals, within one generation, By 2042, people of color are projected to become the majority, making up more than half the population. Hence the idea for the 51% preparedness plan and the initiation of a larger rollout called 2042 Sea Change, Sea spelled S-E-E. In the not-so-distant future, by 2030, more than 50% of Americans under the age of 30 will be people of color. And then closer than you think, by 2023, that's just 8 years from now, more than half of all American children under the age of 18 will be youth of color. Now, women already comprise slightly more than 1/2 of the population. Statistics also reveal that over 60% of theatergoers are women, and over 70% of persons purchasing tickets are women. But here is the reality. The American theater is currently not prepared to welcome new audiences of diverse backgrounds. At the vast majority of theaters, the subscriber
coverage
base
of
is
SphinxCon
overwhelmingly white
is made possible
and rapidly aging. Nor is there infrastructure in place to adequately develop the stories of a new generation. So the future is already here. We depend on the diverse next generation of artists and theater practitioners to continue the advancement of live performance. That is the only way we will have a chance of cultivating new theater audiences. It is a survival imperative. We need time and resources to develop these stories of multiple intersections. That's why I'm giving it 27 years to 2042. That is why we encourage the employment and mentorship of artists and production personnel under the age of 35. They will be our future arts and managing leaders. They are our future storytellers who will be in their 50s when 2042 approaches. So, why have larger American theaters been so slow to responding to the shifting demographics that are literally changing the face of America? What will it take to cause the most established theatrical institutions to envision the future and seize the opportunities presented by it? Now, focusing on race, women, and youth is only a launching pad. It is only a first step. Including senior citizens, the differently abled, LGBT artists, and production personnel is also vital. The key is to begin ensuring that your organization's makeup reflects the world in which we live. Now, everyone needs to be more engaged with our community. We need to know the demographics of our community. We need to survey our stakeholders, our audience, our artists. We need to be more interactive with the community we serve and the community we want to serve. Every theater should create and implement a diversity policy with goals that address the inevitable change in 2042 and bullet point calls to action with a timeline. So this seems like a no-brainer, right? But why haven't theaters pushed for diversity with calls to action when all these numbers seem to necessitate it for survival? Well, here are some frequent comments and questions. Caucasian males over the age of 35 are fearful of losing their jobs. This plan is not meant for anyone to lose their jobs, but we want our artistic and producing leaders to get the big picture and to embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion in their vision of the American theater. If leaders do not embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion, however, it is likely they may be perceived as out of touch with the community they serve. Another comment, diversity programming doesn't make money. Well, have you given diversity a fighting chance? Not being diverse will hit all theaters in the coming decade. Income, both earned and contributed, will be challenged from not going with the trend for more equity, diversity, and inclusion in your organization. Another comment, the talent isn't good enough. Or in the case of my organization, Asians don't look right playing the lead roles in Phantom or Les Mis. Well, I have witnessed thousands of auditions at my theater, from Broadway veterans to youth fresh out of high school, and the talent is incredible. All theaters need to do is to do their due diligence in searching for the right person in casting, directing, and design. And as far as Asians not looking right, playing the roles in Phantom and Les Mis, these barriers have already been broken without much complaint at some courageous, large, and intimate houses. But it's not being done enough. Another comment. I am committed to diversity and intend to move toward those percentages, but I want to meet the 51% goal with a combination of people of color, women, and youth. Well, while we appreciate the effort to add up the diversity components to make the 51%, the big picture is being missed. America is going to be majority minority and is already majority women. So let's deepen our engagement with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Let's take on the challenge and begin addressing the problem right now instead of putting our heads in the sand and hoping somehow, in some way, that things will turn out okay. Another comment. Won't adoption of such diversity plans violate labor laws or be challenged as a discriminatory hiring practice? We are not suggesting that any institution adopt an unlawful quota in hiring, but instead urging you to implement robust, voluntary affirmative action programs that are designed to and do lead to meaningful progress toward achieving diversity goals. In the theater, a robust diversity policy will very likely also include conscious efforts to seek out plays and stories with diverse themes, characters, and playwrights. Another comment. As a passionate theater lover, I'm only interested in a well-told story, great writing, and excellent performances. It doesn't matter to me if there is not an actor of color on stage or that the playwright, director, and other design personnel is overwhelmingly male. Well, of course we want all stories to be well told and great performances. But studies are showing that recognition of oneself in a product ad, on screen, or on stage means a more meaningful connection to the product, and in our case, the story being told on stage. It is important to ask which playwrights are being discussed when planning a season. What kind of director will bring out the most authentic telling of a story that is most appropriate for the community? Are the right questions being asked by the theater's leaders and its boards when it comes to strategic planning in relation to the theater and the communities it serves? We have all witnessed the replication of patterns of misappropriation of culture and misrepresentation of identity throughout the American theater. This discussion makes for successful results in audience development, which translates to box office ticket sales and therefore greater economic health of the theater. I welcome your thoughts and ideas in moving or evolving the many plans and policies at your organization for more equity, diversity, and inclusion in the arts. Thank you so much for listening to the 51% Preparedness Plan for the American Theater. Thank you.
Thank you, Tim. That's really awesome. I'm so impressed by the work that the East-West Players has done over the last less than a year to really develop this plan. And I feel as if it's a challenge to the theater field. It's really a throwdown that says, let's set fire to the talk and allow real change and real action to rise from the ashes. So I also think what's really fantastic is that this is a grassroots effort in a way. It's a peer-driven idea. It says, we're not going to wait for TCG, which is me, or the NEA, or the NFL, or the CIA to tell us what we have to do. We're going to come up with a plan that says, here's a really big idea, a big, hairy, audacious goal idea, and let's challenge others to really try to do this. Let's do it. I think everybody who's here is here because you believe, as I certainly do, that there are structural inequities with respect to opportunity and access for people of color, for women, for people in many other demographic groups that exist in every sector of our society. And we, in the arts, do not want to replicate that structural weakness. We want to model a new way forward. So this is a really great possible step in that direction. One thing that I'd like to say, we work really at TCG, my organization, we're very dedicated to equity and diversity and inclusion, and we have at least 6 points in our diversity and inclusion initiative. There are a few things that we've been noticing. I mean, one is that there's huge demographic transformation happening in our country, but that transformation is unevenly distributed. There's some communities that have been majority-minority for a long time, and there are others that aren't close. There's some theaters that have really started work in earnest to build more diverse and inclusive staffs and boards, and there are others that are just getting started. We know that there's major absence of representation on boards and at the leadership of our largest institutions among people of color and women, for instance. So there's a lot of work to be done, but the challenge may be different for different theaters depending upon where they're located, how they're organized. And so one of the ways that we are answering that, and I actually think that the 51% preparedness plan can fit in with our approach, which is really to offer the theater field a program that's called our Diversity and Inclusion Institute. And it's a very deep 3-year program that includes a cohort of 21 theaters. We're trying to increase the number of cohorts that we have, but it encourages them to develop very specific action plans with timelines and with ways of really keeping each other accountable so that in 5 years, we see dramatic change, whether it's looking specifically at artistic and production staffs, or whether it's looking at an entire organization, or whether it's really focusing in on leadership and board. But I think that having one of our theaters really take this kind of public, specific, and very, I think, inspiring stance and setting an example is really needed and valuable in our field right now. So thank you.
Thank you.
Gary.
I guess I get to be the East German judge. I think the ideal is fantastic, and I applaud you for coming up with it. I think the challenge, however, is it's like this. On the way over here, I heard on a podcast that in 2012, Mitch Romney got the exact same amount of the percentage of white voters that Ronald Reagan got in 1980. The same percentage of white voters. That told me something. What was successful for Reagan in 1980 had demographically changed by 2012. And we knew about these changes beginning after the 1990 census was adopted. So the fact that American theater has been slow to attack this issue is not based on not being aware of the circumstances, it's being unwilling to do it. Frederick Douglass said that power concedes nothing without a demand. And if you look at the progressive movements in this country, whether it's the labor unions, whether it's civil rights, whether it's women's rights, nothing have actually happened without us putting some form of mandate on it, quite frankly. Whether it was, you may have been emancipated in 1865, but it wasn't until 1965 where the federal laws demanded that you had the right to execute your citizenship of voting unencumbered. It's 2015 and many women still exist in this country where they don't get the same amount of earnings for the same job that a man does. So to us expecting that the general theater community is going to do this without some kind of endorsement or strong encouragement, or for lack of a better term, pressure, is unrealistic. The reason why I say this is because right now in England, the new chair of the Art Council of England, Sir Peter Bazalgette, has mandated that going forward from this point, the 670 arts organizations that get funded through his agency are required to, in 3 years, have 20% diversity in regards to staffing and programming. They're going to begin tabulating the data in 2 years. So by 2018, if you don't have at least 20%, you can forget about getting funded by the Art Council England. Now, I think that brings a lot more attention to the issue than just asking people to do right. Because we will get some people that will actually participate, but it will not be effective. The reason why I believe this is because I just look at history. We had in the 80s, Actors Equity started the Non-Traditional Casting Project in an attempt to try to encourage people to hire more minorities and women in roles originally written for white males. And although that did occur, it didn't occur at enough level to impact on the lack of unemployment that existed for minorities and women in Actors Equity. That data still shows they are grossly underrepresented on an annual basis in regards to employment at our major theaters across this country. We had, in the 1990s, the Lila Wallace Reader's Digest Fund support audience development, in which many of our largest regional theaters were funded to diversify their staffs and do programming that would diversify their audiences. And once the funding was cut off, many of those jobs and those people and that programming disappeared almost overnight. So in regards to what we're talking about here, we need to have resources, and we need to have some kind of pressure brought to people to make them actually look at this. It will not occur otherwise. It will occur at some level, but not to the level that we want to see. If we want to see really dramatic systemic change. We are forced to drink water that's that has fluoride in it. That means this because that's mandated. We're mandated to have insurance, to get a license to drive a car. That's a mandate. I think if we want to really stop talking about this and start seeing action occur, we have to think seriously about how we're going to create a system that's going to actually make people aware of the fact that there's a penalty of continuing the status as it is today.
Several gauntlets dropped right here at the beginning. Gary, let me ask you a question. As the audience is beginning to formulate what they want to hear, let me just off the top ask you this question. Where do you think such pressure could be effectively generated?
Well, I think like in England, funders, quite frankly. I think that that's a source of pressure. I think there are also, when we're talking about federal, I know Tim said that we don't want to push or encourage NEA right off, but only reason why in many cases affirmative action worked was because there were penalties in regards to getting government contracts. That's just a reality. The reason why we have the wealth of black millionaires that came out of this community or businesses that were established here through the auto industry was directly because of programmings that, yes, did quotas, and yes, also mandated that they had to have a certain percentage of their suppliers be people of color. I just don't see any other way of doing it because I just don't think we have the will. Systems exist because they benefit somebody. And right now, the lack of diversity that exists in this community benefits a certain somebody. It's not going to change unless that somebody is made aware of the fact that they are going to be made uncomfortable by a new system.
Teresa, how does that land when you apply the ears of TCG theaters across the country?
Well, I think it's a really interesting point that Gary makes, and certainly we hear it often. There's also very frequently reference to the Rooney Rule in the NFL, where there is a penalty to teams that don't interview people of color for coach and assistant coach and I believe general manager positions. That was very successful when it was first introduced. I don't know if what the success rate has been in recent years in terms of the hires that have been made. And so when we think about what might that entity be that could create that source of pressure or that system shift, it's not as clear who has the ability to actually put a fine on everyone for not meeting certain criteria. In the theater field, I mean, this is why at TCG what we've focused on more is really trying to encourage the constant dialogue about equity, diversity, and inclusion supported by programs that make it possible for our theaters to actually get involved in developing action plans and taking action. Maybe that's not ultimately as effective as that combined with some system of penalty would be. But again, I don't know exactly what entity would be the entity to create the kind of systemic change through that methodology that you're talking about. I think the Arts Council in England probably supports a very large percentage of each of the arts organizations' budgets there.
Yeah, they do.
Yeah.
They do.
So,
far more than here.
and I would like to think that we really can build an increasing number of theaters in our community that do have very serious action plans.
But I think part of the problem is that this is coming evident to us now because of the fact that of the demographic change that Tim talks about.
Right.
And you're right, it's going to continue to grow to a point where whites are not the majority of this country. However, that doesn't mean that they're not going to be still the majority of people who have control of the levers of power in this country. And if we want real diversity, we have to develop it at that level as well. And I'm sorry, hiring James Earl Jones to do Big Daddy and Cat on a Hot Tin Roof is not my idea of diversity. Diversity requires us to look at what we used to call multiculturalism and having a more broader perspective of arts and culture in this community that comes from different cultural backgrounds, where there is an Asian American theater, there is a Jewish American theater, there is an African American theater that supports, and you can go see. You can't take it with you without having to look, without worrying about, there's a diverse audience. Here you can go and you can look at different plays from different points of view. And I personally prefer that than to trying to shoehorn people into large organizations because we want some sense of, we want to make ourselves look better or look right. And that's just not what I'm into.
Let's take it to our participants in the room. Who has a clarifying question or a statement that must be said or an idea that contributes to this conversation? And throw up your hand and pause long enough for us to get a microphone to you. Yes, over in that corner.
I was going to yell.
Please stand up so we can see you.
I was very interested in Gary's point of view, and I'm trying to figure out whether or not the NEA has such a contract when they give out grants to other funding organizations, who then in turn take those grants and then subcontract or sub-grant them out. Anybody?
Anybody?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Can you repeat the question?
In terms of federal contracting, all federal contracts usually have some kind of non-discriminatory clause. A lot of art organizations get funding from the National Endowment for the Arts, either those art organizations or local or state organizations. So I'm wondering if that isn't a place to start, where the NEA, who makes these grants, has a similar kind of contract to include diversity into whatever organization they're granting to.
Mm-hmm. Anybody know if that's a window of opportunity? Teresa?
I think if the NEA and the state arts agencies and private funders together were able to have a similar standard that encouraged organizations, that required some kind of reporting in terms of diversity at all levels of an organization, as well as some policies about their funding, about funding organizations that actually have a very well-defined policy regarding diversity and inclusion, that could be very effective. I think all of us who receive funds know that if a funder asks us those questions, we stop and we really take a hard look at who we are and who's on our staffs. We're actually at TCG, we have a survey that we're beta testing right now called Represent, which allows staff people who are parts of organizations to self-identify in 8 areas of identity so that we can get a really clear picture of who's working in our theaters. And that's going to be very telling right there. But if funders are saying, we really want you to look at this and we want to know the composition of your organizations and how you are setting up action, really serious action plans that are measurable with goals and with some kind of financial resource behind building a more diverse organization in order to receive our funding, that would have an impact for sure.
I think that is actually a next step in the 2042 Sea Change Plan, is to actually have that dialogue with funders about, in terms of your grant guidelines, is there a way in which you can ask the organization, what is your plan for diversity, or what are some other instruments that you could use to attain a certain diverse community?
So one of the things I'm clearly hearing from here is Teresa's suggestion of coordinating standards amongst all those who have influence in this area, and then coordinating reporting, benchmark expectations, and then funding policy eventually. So there's this idea of conversations that get some alignment amongst those who do have influence, and then really getting common standards that make clear and begin to have consequences. Yes, hand in that, right in that area, and then the next person was right over there.
Hi, Clay Lord with Americans for the Arts. I guess I'm getting a little bit wary of this idea of coordinating a bunch of standards and setting up a rubric that people have to qualify into. I guess my starting question is, you've had a lot of conversation about a particular vision of multiculturalism and this idea that every organization should try and attain this particular set of goals. And I wonder for a moment if the organization is the right point to try to be forcing such homogeneity, ironically, in this conversation. If every organization actually needs to be pursuing the same kind of type of multiculturalism, regardless of the type of art that they're doing, whether they're a standard LORT-style organization or they are a culturally specific organization that specializes in some sort of music that is the part of one particular group's tradition. I get very wary of that, and I particularly get wary of it when we're placing the power of arbitrating that largely in the hands of organizations, foundations, who may have had a substantial change in how they think about issues of diversity and equity, but often emerged from incredibly inequitable situations and have perpetuated those situations for decades.
Gary.
Yeah, number one, we have homogeneity now. We are the predominant culture that is presented in our arts community across this country is Western European and European American. That is a reality. So we got homogeneity right now. What I'm talking about is breaking it up. If you really want diversity tomorrow, start funding diverse organizations today. Secondly, you were talking about, I'm curious as to why you're uncomfortable with that. The fact that what we're talking, at least what I'm proposing, is having different cultural organizations representing in all art disciplines the mosaic that is of expression through those art disciplines. There's a reason why this country created jazz and no other country could. It was because we had Creole Americans who were trained up understanding classical music, therefore they knew how to read and write it. And you had African Americans who came out of a blues tradition in the delta of this country who were steep in the power of improvisation. And so you combine those and you create a whole musical tradition that both encompasses the ability to improvise on a constant basis, at the same time create a music that is written down, because if we had left it just to the people who were into improv, we wouldn't have jazz today because there would be no documentation. And if we had left it only to the people who were classically trained in European music, we wouldn't have it today because it wouldn't have provided the breadth of live performance. Every musical tradition today, with the exception of classical music, provides an opportunity for improvisation. So you can't tell me that we can't do this. and that it can't benefit our art disciplines better by greater diversity than what we have today.
No, and I agree with that. And I think where my question is, so for example, we're in the middle of a research project. One of the organizations is a balalaika society, which is a traditional Russian art form. One of the issues they're having is that the community in which they exist, or the community that they came out of, the traditional Russian community of that area, is shrinking. And so they're really grappling with the question of, is a pursuit of multiculturalism a good thing for the reason that their organization exists, which has a lot more to do with perpetuating cultural identity than it does with anything essentially multicultural. And so I think you're right. There's a tremendous value in crossing disciplines. There's a tremendous value in encouraging unique combinations of people to participate in different and varied art forms. My question is mostly, I think, actually more based on what Tim's presenting, which, at least in the aggregate, sounds very much like a quota system that doesn't take particular regard for the specific mission of any given organization. Also understanding that that's a great way to let people off the hook, and that's not what I'm proposing.
You know, I have talked with the artistic leaders of Southern California because we looked at the LA Unified School District, which is 91% youth of color. So obviously, Los Angeles or Southern California, we've already missed the 51% because we're already at 91%. And these are our future, you know, storytellers, playwrights, and future audience. And so how are we going to keep them? Theater is going to die if we don't bring them into the theater. And how are we going to bring them into the theater unless they see themselves and see their story? And particularly with my under 35 option, that the millennials really think differently when it comes to programming and their form of entertainment. The form of entertainment that we see with millennials deal with a lot of intersections. They don't want to be just identified as Asian American, but you know, I am LGBT, I am Asian American, I do this and do that and do that. Do not confine me to this box. And so I think the leaders of American theater, who are probably, you know, in their 40s and 50s, probably white, really need to take a look at that and examine it. And so it's an evolutionary process. You know, all the leaders that I've talked to said, you know, 5 years is really tough, but it's an evolutionary process. And we really support what you're doing, but it's going to take a lot longer to turn the ship around. But the good thing is they're starting to turn the ship around, but just not fast enough.
Right over here.
Hi, I'm Mitch with Chorus America, and before my National Service Organization life, I was the head of grants and programs at the State Arts Commission in Arizona, and that state's not known for its, you know, diversity policies and all that great stuff, but we did mandate that boards had to be diverse and that the programming should be diverse, and if you were going to apply for a grant, you had to do it. And so we would travel around the state, rural, urban, you send the brown kid around the state to talk about this, and the big question is, how? How do I do this? And that is still a question that my current organization members grapple with every day. So we can put policies on the table. I'm sure the Arts Council of England, before they made this mandate, is having resources to say, this is how to do it. And so my question in this room is, how do we get our organizations, and not just theater, every art form, to get to that possible 51%? What is the tools? Is it just traditional community development? Because if that's what it is, why is it so difficult? So the how is really important to be talking about beyond just the facts and figures and the intrinsic moments that we're having about this conversation. So that's just the question I'd like to throw out is, how do we get our organizations to do this kind of work?
Well, Teresa, you certainly have a how in your 3-year leadership development program at TCG. What has been learned in that that is more expandable for others?
Well, again, our overall diversity and inclusion, equity, diversity, and inclusion plan, we're really working on 6 different fronts. The Diversity Inclusion Institute, what we've learned is that the theaters, once they sit down with each other, with help, I mean, we actually have a really remarkable consultant working with us, Carmen Morgan, and a staff at TCG who's really devoted to this work. When they really sit down and focus in on their organizations and understand where the challenges exist in terms of building more diverse organizations, and then focus in on very specific steps that they're going to take with deadlines and with ways of holding themselves and their colleagues in this cohort accountable, we're just seeing that they're making progress. An example is the Dallas Theater Center really decided that they wanted to focus initially on building a more diverse board. And they realized the only way to do that was to sit down, to get a consultant of their own, have a whole day retreat or longer, and figure out how they were going to identify people in their community who should be on their board, who would be interested in being on their board, and to stop just saying, we don't know anyone, we can't think of anyone who would want to be on this board. And very quickly, they went from having 1 or 2 candidates of color for their board to having 20, and they've changed the composition of their board just in a year very significantly. So I think it's, being in a long-standing program, so 3 years, having the support available, the expertise, really studying and understanding the current conditions within your organization and having very specific action plans to move forward are what's working for most of these organizations. The other thing I'll just mention really quickly is that we have a Spark leadership program, which is really developing leaders of color who are very, very equipped to run theaters. Just because we don't like hearing the pipeline, there's not a pipeline. There is, actually. And we just need to put our pipeline together with the jobs, ultimately.
We're down to our last minute, so let me just ask, Gary, Tim, any comments on the how or any wrapping up thoughts?
If you want more diversity, to fund diverse organizations. Again, if there is not a community available in the area that'll allow them to actually be incorporated into what we call the large regional organizations, don't ask them to go searching out for people. That's just, I'm really honest about that. If you want authentic work done from a different cultural perspective, support organizations that are currently already doing that work. Don't push a round peg into a square hole.
Yeah, and the closing word to Challenger Tim.
I think that the artistic leader of the organization has got to champion diversity. The organization has got to want that, and it's going to take a lot of dialogue. If I can use East West Players as a case study, we have 11 board members. 9 of them are Asian, 2 of them are white. I would like to see a more diverse board on our Asian American theater. Why can't we have an African American board member at an Asian American theater? Why can't we have a Latino? So we are actively looking and looking at that. So the first thing that we're going to do is that we're going to our corporate funders who have affinity groups and say, is there someone who would like to sit on an arts board? So we're going to Southern California Edison, we're going to Wells Fargo, and asking them, is there someone who you would like to place on our board that is a champion of diversity? So that's one way of the how.
Thank you. Just before we say thanks to our guests, we're going to remind you we have a little 10-minute break now, but this is not a go-away break. This is 10 minutes for you to think about this question. If you were going to take Tim's 2042 challenge seriously, what would be the how for you? For the organization you work with, for the work that you do that has a stake in this goal, what would be the how that you would take away from this conference? So take these transitional minutes and get some notes for yourself about the implications for you, what the takeaways may be for you, or what the questions you need to investigate over our remaining days together. And as you start to do that, thank you to our panel.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm curious.